Welcome everyone to Red Everbloom, now with 90% less wall jumping. This is one of the lower difficulty Mythic dungeons on the spectrum of 10 of them. It's a good place to start for a new group, as the only particularly challenging encounter is the second boss. But before we get to there, let's have a look at some of the trash. The very first group of trash consists of a Dreadsoul Poisoner, along with these two Frenzied Nightclaws. The Frenzied Nightclaws are one of the more dangerous enemies in the dungeon. They're going to leap at a random range target and leave a bleed on them that can only be dispelled when the target's healed above 90% HP. If both of these leap at the same target, you can see they take very heavy damage. The Dreadsoul Poisoner is a bit less dangerous. All he'll do is apply a toxin debuff to a random player, and this debuff will make you explode around you when the debuff expires. So if you get this debuff, just get away from your friends and let the explosion go off. Overall, not very dangerous. The next pack had an additional Frenzied Nightclaw, along with this new enemy, these Mind-Shattered Screechers. Now all these will do is cast a interruptible spell at a random target that disorients them, this unerring screech. There's not much you can do about this, besides just interrupt what you can, but given that there's 4 of them in this group, it's hard to get all of those. So expect some of your DPS players or your healer to take random spikes of damage. Overall though, if you just throw out some AoE stuns and interrupt where you can, it's not very dangerous. Ahead here is a single enemy, the Festerhead Grizzly. Now, these can do quite a lot of tank damage and they'll do a frontal slash attack, so it's a good idea not to get anyone in front of them. Additionally, they're going to do a roar, and every time this maddening roar is cast, you'll take increasing damage from the next one. The final ability is the Spew Corruption, in which they'll summon all these little red evil guys, the Nightmare Abominations, and they'll fixate players and leave a trail of bad stuff behind them as they run around. So you can stun these, just group them all into a group, stun them and kill them all, and if they do manage to spread some of the red trail, just make sure you're not standing in it. As you head into the cave on the right here, you'll be met with a double pull of these Dreadsoul Runers. Now these have 2 spells. The first one is Despair, which deals some tank damage and debuffs the tank with reduced healing. The second skill, which is more dangerous, is the Star Shower ability. Now if this ability is cast, there's going to be lots of red swirls all over the ground, and you simply have to move out of these because a few seconds later there'll be like a moonfire sort of effect drop down and it'll damage anyone who's standing in it. So pretty much you can let the Despair cast go through so long as the debuff doesn't stack too high, but the Star Shower needs to be interrupted. Now you don't actually have to pull this pack on the right here. This was one of our first times in the dungeon, so we weren't particularly familiar with it. But if you do happen to pull this, it's just 2 Dreadsoul Poisoners and an additional Grizzly Bear here. Deal with these as before. If you get the poison debuff, move away from your friends. And with the Grizzly, you want to be killing the little red ads and moving out of the pool they leave. There will be some AoE damage because of the Grizzly's roars plus the poison, but it should be nothing you can't handle with a few cooldowns, such as Tranquility. The pack you do have to pull is this pack with the Dreadsoul Poisoners along with these Crazed Razorbeaks. Now all these Razorbeaks will do is charge with a propelling charge. You can move out of this, so it's a simple matter of watching which direction they're going and then getting out of the way. Beyond that, they don't really do a great deal. So long as you can keep an eye on their facing and notice when they're casting, just sidestep out of the way, they should be pretty trivial to kill. You can get around a lot of the trash simply by going through this gap in the rocks here. There's a patrol that goes around here every so often, but if you just keep an eye out you can easily skip that. The group at the bottom here, it's probably safe to pull it because chances are someone is going to. I believe it may be skippable, but every time we've been here so far someone has managed to grab it. This pack just consists of a Dreadsoul Runer, a Poisoner, and 2 of the Nightclaws. If you focus down the Runer, you can have all your interrupts stopping the Despair and the Starfalls. And then afterwards, you just want to AoE the rest of the pack down. Beware of the bleeds the Nightclaws leave. As a paladin, I can support a bit with my Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Sacrifice, just to help the ranged DPS out there. And you'll see this patrol has arrived. It's an extra Runer along with even more Nightclaws. This could have been quite messy if we hadn't killed the previous Nightclaws, as the damage from this debuff could stack up pretty quickly. Fortunately, we're just killing off the rest of that pack, so we can easily dispatch these 2 Nightclaws along with this extra runer. Just remember to interrupt the runer's debuffs and try and support the people who get leapt on by the Nightclaws, either by healing them above 90% or by granting them some sort of immunity such as Blessing of Sacrifice, or them using their own personal ice blocks. Now this patrol we're skipping here, you see on the left, it's not a wise idea to skip this because they do patrol down very, very far. We didn't quite realise they'd come down quite as far as they would, so we just continued past them towards these grizzly bears instead. It is a double pull of these grizzlies, so things get very messy if you aren't focusing your damage properly. So for that reason I just marked this skull, and I had everyone in my group focus down this skull quickly so he can't get more than 1 roar off. If you start getting to like 4 and 5 roar casts, you start looking at your group members getting 1 shot, so it's pretty unpleasant. Generally you want 1 of these focused quickly, and then you can deal with the extra one in a more tidy manner by cleaning up the ads and so on. Generally the tank damage for this pull is pretty high. I just want to throw a few cooldowns out there. You won't need them for the upcoming boss, so feel free to use them. You'll see at this point, I haven't quite noticed yet, but on the left that patrol has been pulled. They're messing us up quite a big deal. It's probably quite a lot to do with my fault because I hadn't noticed them quick enough. By the time I get there it's probably a bit too late. So yeah, we did wipe here, so it's generally a good idea for you not to pull the bears before you've dispatched these 2 guys. So with all of those dispatched, you find yourself at the first boss, this Archdruid. Generally he's pretty easy, he doesn't really do a whole lot that's going to cause you much problem. He shares the same bleeding debuff that the Frenzied Nightclaws did earlier, so you'll be used to dealing with that by now. Just heal the targets up, grant them some sort of defensive to reduce the damage. Generally not too difficult, since you only have to deal with 1 at a time rather than 3 or 4 as you did previously. Additionally, he's going to spawn the same little red guys that leave the trails as they move around. Deal with them in the same way as you did in the bears. Stun them if you can, nuke them down. They don't have a lot of HP. The faster you kill them, the better, leaves you more room to deal with. Generally not very difficult, but could cause a problem if they're completely ignored. So unless you're doing this fight like really, really wrong, these guys shouldn't really cause any problem. The next mechanic here that has you moving around a lot is the Nightfall. What he's going to do is pull down a corrupted star from the sky, and you'll create an area of nightmare corruption on the ground, and this will inflict heavy shadow damage to anyone who's standing within it. It can be a little difficult to see because it's sort of red on red. I think red is a bit of a theme in this dungeon, and sometimes it's to the detriment of the visibility of the skills. But if you yourself taking a lot of damage, you can probably be rest assured that you're standing on the evil red and not the good red. So just get out of the way. The final mechanic is the one that the tanks have to be concerned with. This is the Primal Rampage. He's going to do a big knockback on you. Generally he'll knock you back right to the edge of the arena, and then after a few seconds he's going to charge straight at you, and he'll damage anyone who's in the way of the charge. If you move quickly, you can get out of the way of this charge, but if you do find yourself getting hit by it, just want to pop a small defensive cooldown so you don't die to the subsequent melee attacks. Generally though, you should be able to move out of every single one of these, because he doesn't really track your location very well. If you just sprint a little to the left or the right, depending on how much room you've got and depending on where the debuffs are, you'll be perfectly fine. All in all, pretty easy boss. It's a good idea not to spend your heroism here and save it for the next boss because he's the more difficult one. One extra fun tidbit on this boss as well is that if you have a druid in your group, the boss has some extra dialogue lines in which he'll comment on your druid's artifact. So yeah, you can sort of stroke the ego of your druids a bit by him complimenting you and telling you you're powerful and your artifact's amazing, and just feel generally pretty good about yourself. So as you continue down the path after the boss, you're going to be met with this Darkheart Dryad and these Velthorn Blossoms. Now the Dryad is a ranged creature, so you'll have to engage it directly. You can't wait for it to come back, and she's just going to spam throw a spear on you. She'll also do a disengage occasionally and just throw herself back a bit. This disengage is based on sort of the same direction the tank is facing, so if you sort of go behind her, she'll disengage towards your party, which is a good thing to do, because you don't want her disengaging further away into extra trash. Additionally, she has a poison spear ability. It reduces the healing the tank takes by 25% and inflicts some poison damage over time. You just want to get rid of that, it's not too difficult. The other ability these Velthorn Blossoms have is just to launch these roots from the ground, And this is a cast time spell that they have, however it's not interruptible. Generally, if you see the rumbling earth beneath you, just get out of the way. It doesn't hit for a whole lot of damage, but there's no reason to stand in it. Move out of the way, save your healer some trouble. Further down the road here is an additional Dryad, along with 2 more Velthorn Blossoms, but this time we also have a Keeper, and these Keepers will keep the Velthorn Blossoms on full HP so long as they're alive. So you want to deal with these Keepers quickly before you can AoE down the Blossoms. The other ability these Keepers have, which probably isn't showcased very well in this video because it was actually bugged for a while and has only recently been hotfixed, is the Vile Mushroom. Now they're going to grow a mushroom at a random location, and if you trigger this mushroom by walking near it, it's going to detonate for about 500k damage. You'll see in this video that the mushrooms don't actually do anything at all. We were even having a bit of a discussion about that. Just at some point we get to the mushrooms and we're thinking to ourselves, wait a minute, these mushrooms aren't actually doing anything. But they have since been hotfixed, so don't stand in them like we are here, because they weren't hurting us, but they will hurt you. Down the path here, you'll sort of be met with a central garden area. There's a patrolling pack here consisting of a Dryad with 2 Velthorn Blossoms. You do have an extra pack quite nearby, so make sure your tank positions himself appropriately so the Dryad doesn't leap back into the extra pack and pull more trash than you can deal with. There isn't really a high priority target here, just AoE this down, it's not too difficult. Now the pack you wanted to avoid ninja pulling here is one consisting of these 2 Keepers, along with a few Velthorn Blossoms. As before, these Keepers have an aura that prevents you from killing the Velthorn Blossoms before you've dealt with the Keepers. For that reason, this pack can sometimes stay alive a little bit of a long time, so make sure you have tank cooldowns and healer mana available as needed. Beyond that, just move out of the root bursts from the Blossoms and just single target down the Keepers one at a time. After that, you can easily dispatch the Velthorn Blossoms. Also watch out for these mushrooms. You can see here, they're really not doing anything, but they have been hotfixed. They will hurt you if you stand in them. Now, down this path here, visibility starts to get really bad from all this mist. It's kind of annoying. I'm not sure I really like the design decision just to limit your visibility so much, but it is what it is. As you go down, you're met with 1 more Rotheart Dryad and 2 additional Blossoms. Nothing special about these, deal with them the same way you did the previous pack. Watch out for the Dryad jumping, try and position her against a wall so she goes backwards into the wall and doesn't move. Beyond that, just spam your AoE to take them all down. The new enemy you meet here are these Nightmare Dwellers. Now they look a bit intimidating, but actually they're pretty easy. They don't really do any tank damage and they only have 1 mechanic, which is very easy to counter. You can see they have this Tormenting Eye cast. It just deals some damage over time, and at the end of the cast you're going to be feared. However, the cast is interruptible and they're also stunnable, so you shouldn't really ever let this cast go through, and if you do, it's only a small fear anyway. So generally these guys are pretty lame, they don't really pose any kind of danger, and you should deal with them kind of easily. Despite the fact that you can pull them one by one, you shouldn't really hesitate to pull 2 or even 3 if you have properly assigned interrupts. They're that trivial. So we finally reached the second boss, and this guy's the toughest one in the dungeon in my opinion. This is the one where you want to be using your long cooldowns, things like heroism and so on. Really, most of his mechanics are very simple. The main difficulty comes in his Crushing Grip mechanic, which deals an immense amount of tank damage. If you don't have cooldowns up for this, it's almost certain that you're going to die. What he's going to do is pick up the tank, deal heavy damage over time, and then throw you at a target, dealing AoE damage in that area. So it's going to inflict several times your HP bar unless you have a defensive cooldown up. The other tank mechanic is this Nightmare Breath. It's the slightly less dangerous one. All he'll do is spew fire damage in the area in front of you, so make sure that nobody else is in front besides the tank. The fire damage deals some damage over time and then leaves a debuff which deals even more damage over time. Another mechanic the tank has to worry about, you're noticing a theme for this boss, it's kind of all on your tank, are these Velthorn saplings. They're just going to go around and hit some people. They're not really a high priority to kill, but just make sure they're all picked up and tanked. For your DPS and healers to worry about, there is the Shattered Earth. This is just a small cast time that's going to knock back everyone and deal some damage. to everyone that gets knocked back. Not really anything you can do about this, just deal with the damage and run back in to attack the boss. The main problem comes when he combinations this with the strangling roots. You'll see here there are these various strangling roots health bars around the place. They're basically just traps. What they're going to do is spawn in an area, and then they'll just sit there until someone walks over them. When you do walk over them, you'll take some light damage over time, but you will be rooted in place for a whole minute or until someone frees you from the trap. So the boss will usually combo this by placing these traps down and then doing the knockback. So if you aren't careful about your positioning, you can be knocked back into a trap. But it's generally pretty easy to make sure that you aren't going to get knocked back. You just have to be mindful of the fact that this can happen, and it is going to happen. Beyond that, the best thing I can say about this boss is just kill him quickly. Use every cooldown you have because the tank damage really adds up quickly. And if your tank isn't properly geared, then they can die after maybe 2 or 3 of these grips. So, simple mechanics, just high numbers. Now at this point you have a choice of 2 routes. You can head immediately to the last boss, or you can go to the left hand path towards Dresaron. It's kind of your own choice. For the purposes of this video I will cover Dresaron, his mechanics, but you do have the option just to go directly to the Shade of Xavius. For the Dresaron path, you're going to be met with all these little blood globules, the hate spawn slimes. Now the only mechanic these guys have is to explode when they die. So you want to AoE them down, and then as they're dying, you move out of the way. They don't explode immediately on death, they sort of have a bubbling animation, and then they burst, so there's a lot of time to get out of the way. As you proceed into this water area, you'll notice the eggs on the side. Now, if you walk over one of these, you're going to lose 50 DKP, and you're going to spawn some whelps. Generally the whelps are pretty harmless, but if you get a lot of them at once, then you could run into some problems if your tank can't pick them up. This big red elemental is the Blood-Tainted Fury. He has 2 mechanics. He's going to do a frontal charge attack called Blood Assault, and this is deceptively big. It's much bigger than his hitbox, and you can even be damaged if you're behind him, as you'll see from my footage here. And this can knock you into eggs, and it will probably knock you into eggs more than once. The other mechanic is this red orb he drops on the ground. Again, this also knocks you back, so beware of the eggs. When this guy dies, he explodes into these blood-tainted bursters. If these aren't killed fast enough, they will reform into the big elemental again. However, if they do reform and you kill the big guy again, he won't burst into small ones anymore. He'll be dead after that. However, it's still a bit of a nuisance having to deal with him twice, so if you can stun these and AoE them down, you should definitely do so. Generally, the hate spawn slimes are pretty harmless. If you want to pull more than 1 pack at once, you can do so. However, when dealing with the big red elementals, it's best to get them by themselves, just in case they knock people into whelps, because it's very likely to happen, given that both of their mechanics involve knocking people around. So with all of that evil red stuff out of the way, we've reached the next boss, the Dragon Dresaron. He's probably a little bit more difficult than the first boss is, but he's still easier than the second one, so he shouldn't really pose much of a problem for you, even if you still have your Bloodlust debuff at this point. And the first mechanic to watch out for on this boss is his Breath of Corruption. He's going to pause for a moment, and then he'll do a frontal breath attack for a few seconds. If you get hit by this, you'll take heavy nature damage, and you'll have an armor reduction debuff. However, unlike the second boss, you can move out of this breath, so you should definitely aim to do that. The next mechanic he has is this earth-shaking roar. He's going to do a roar and deal some damage to everyone, and then he's going to cause an area of falling rocks, targeted at a random player's location. So melee players should try and spread out around him, and ranged players should use the large room available to them. These falling rocks deal a lot of damage, so you don't want to stand at these for any more than a few seconds if possible. The next mechanic is this downdraft, similar to the pushback on bosses like Jikun. It's just going to push players away from him. You can run against it, and you'll generally make headway if you do, but just make sure you don't get pushed against these rocks. One tip I found is if you stand directly under him, he's barely going to push you at all, so this mostly trivializes the entire mechanic. One thing to watch out for here is the Breath of Corruption. He's always going to target this at a player in melee range, so as a tank, if you try and run away, to get away from the falling rocks or just to get knocked away from the downdraft, he will target a melee player with the breath. So all melee players on this fight should be prepared to move away in the circumstance that he targets the breath at you. However, as a tank, if you're just careful of the breath cooldowns and you stay close to him whenever they're about to come, you can entirely avoid this problem. All in all, dodge rocks, dodge breath, not much else to it. Relatively easy boss, and there isn't much of a healing or damage check. So after Dresaron, you jump down into this sort of hollowed out tree here to find more demons. Hurrah, who would have guessed? Anyway, there's these Dreadfire imps along with this Taintheart summoner. The imps are just going to spam an interruptible spell called Firebolt at your tank. Deals some moderate fire damage. Overall it's not particularly dangerous though. The one you have to watch out for is the Dread Inferno. This is going to target a random player and create a fiery explosion at their location, damaging everyone around that for more than the firebolt. So if you see the fire swirls, you want to get out of the way, and generally you want to have your players spread out to avoid taking extra damage from these infernos. The Taintheart summoners, despite the name, don't actually summon anything. So if you're worried about summoners from, say, Upper Blackrock Spire, you needn't be here because these guys do not call in extra troops. Their main ability is a spammable Shadow Bolt, which deals some shadow damage to the tank. It's a bit more than Firebolt, but it's still not too dangerous, maybe about 10% of your health. The other ability is Cursive Isolation, and this is going to curse a random target and cause them to deal shadow damage to any enemy nearby. So as the name of the curse suggests, you just want to isolate yourself from the other players, get away from them, and you can avoid the shadow damage. The next group is very similar to the previous one, although we now have the addition of a Taintheart Stalker. This guy just deals some melee damage to your tank, and he's going to use an ability called Dark Hunt, in which he'll sort of shadow step to 2 random targets and deal around 200k shadow damage to them. There's not much you can do about this, it's an instant cast. However, if you are afraid of that damage, you can just stun him to stop him from moving around. Upon appearing back at his location, he's going to be behind the tank, so you may have to turn around just to be prepared to sort of get your block and parry back up. The third group here is entirely new enemies. It's these Tormented Bloodseekers. And these guys are very, very damaging. They're some of the more damaging trash in the dungeon. As well as dealing heavy melee damage, they're going to leave this disease debuff on you, which leeches life from you and gives it back to the bats. It's not a lot of life leached, however if you can dispel it, it counts as a lot of effective DPS, because it stops them from healing up. Besides the fact that the debuff just deals a reasonable amount of damage itself as well, so if you have the means to get rid of this, definitely do so. Beyond that, pop some minor tank cooldowns, however don't use your big ones, because the next pack is much more damaging and you will need them for that. The final group before the boss here is sort of a mixture of everything you've met before, along with one new enemy, the Taintheart Deadeye. You'd think, introducing a new enemy at this point, this guy means business. However, he's probably the most trivial enemy in the entire pack. All he's going to do is spam an arrow attack at your tank for some moderate damage. Additionally, he's going to ignite a random ranged player with his Scorching Shot, which deals around 35k damage every 2 seconds. Very, very trivial amount of damage. His final ability is equally lame. All he'll do is teleport himself away a short distance and leave a clone of himself in place. However, the clone has almost no HP and deals almost no damage. So I really don't know what the point of this ability is. If it's just to make him look a little bit more intimidating, because he certainly needs it. Besides that, just interrupt the summoner, move out with the curse, dispel the debuff from the bats, and just AoE down the pack with using some heavy tank cooldowns, given that there's a lot of enemies in this pack, and perhaps some AoE stuns. If you have something like a shaman or a demon hunter, just get the whole group locked down for 5 seconds. Generally, there's not too much mechanically complex on this pack, however it is a lot of tank damage just given the number of enemies, so be prepared to deal with that. The final boss of the dungeon is sort of a middling difficulty. This is the Shade of Xavius. Now he has 2 main mechanics to watch out for. One of them is the Nightmare debuff and the other is the Paranoia debuff. Now if you have the Nightmare debuff, you have to have another player inside the ring that's around you. If you do not have another player inside this ring, you're going to be silenced and pacified. So basically you become useless unless you're near someone else. The second debuff is the Paranoia one. This works the opposite of the Nightmare. If anyone else is near you, you're going to pacify them. So basically follow the simple rule of Nightmare, be near other players, Paranoia, be away from other players. As well as that, he has this Feed on the Weak debuff. This deals heavy damage over time to whoever is targeted by. This can be quite dangerous because the Growing Paranoia and the Nightmare Bolts both deal damage on application. So if you're applied with this debuff and then he does Feed on the Weak on you, you can be sort of killed pretty quickly. So it's worth keeping an eye out with stuff like Lay on Hands, Blessing of Sacrifice, any sort of emergency cooldown in case someone's HP dips low. At 50%, he's going to start the Apocalyptic Nightmare. He'll deal heavy damage to everyone, and then he'll begin calling down these sort of red meteors from the sky. If these meteors hit anyone, it's going to buff the boss's damage by 5% for around 10 seconds, and this effect stacks. So you want to make sure to avoid these at all costs. Unless you're trying to do the achievement, which is to get 10 stacks, in which case, just jump in them as much as you can. Generally though, stay out of these. They deal heavy damage, they buff the boss. They're kind of bad news overall. Apart from that, the usual stuff continues to apply. Nightmare debuff, be near someone. Paranoia debuff, be away from someone. Overall, not much in the fight changes besides avoiding these purple buffs. If you can deal with the first phase mechanics as well as avoid the purple blobs, then he's a pretty easy boss. Overall, he can deal some moderate damage in the last phase, but it's nothing you shouldn't be able to handle if you've reached it to this stage. So thanks for watching this guide on the Everbloom, was it called, I think? Yeah, that sounds about right. It's one of the easier Mythic dungeons, so good place to start, and after this you can start heading for some of the more difficult ones with your newly acquired loot. Thanks for watching.